Alabama head coach Nick Saban has officially announced his retirement from college football. And while some of you Gamecock fans might not expect this, Saban's departure could have a great impact on South Carolina.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and also a staff writer for Gamecock Digest over on SI.com. Thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first watch or listen for your team here today. We are free and available, as always, both on YouTube and wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. It was the news that sent shockwaves throughout the college football world on Thursday evening. Head coach Nick Saban of the Alabama Crimson Tide officially announced his retirement. Obviously, this is something that has been sort of rumored, or it's been a rumbling for the past year or two, but when it comes to a coach as great as Nick Saban, you never really expect it until it actually happens. And so Nick Saban retiring from football, this is obviously going to change a lot regarding college football and also the Southeastern Conference as a whole. But this could also have potential ramifications for South Carolina as well, in a couple different areas, both when it comes to coaches and also players. Let's start off with the coaching side of things. Obviously, with Nick Saban leaving Alabama, the Crimson Tide, they are moving quickly to try and find a replacement for the man that's considered the greatest of all time in this sport. And a couple of the coaches that they could be considering are coaches that, as of right now, South Carolina is either quite familiar with or they're going to be familiar with very quickly in the next few years. The first name I'll throw out there is obviously Clemson head coach Dabo Swinney. If Dabo Swinney were to be the guy at Alabama, this would obviously change everything for South Carolina when it comes to the Palmetto Bowl, because obviously ever since Dabo Swinney has been at Clemson, and really truthfully since Steve Spurrier left South Carolina back in 2015, the rivalry's been very one-sided. Yes, South Carolina won in 2022, and in 2023 you could argue if a couple plays go differently and the offense has some semblance of life, South Carolina wins that game. But Dabo Swinney and the Tigers have held a stranglehold over this rivalry for the last 8-9 years. If Dabo were to leave Clemson, then that would change a lot. It would change things for the Tigers. They would have to conduct probably a nationwide coaching search for a new head man of their own program. And for Shane Beamer and the Gamecocks, it would give them an opportunity to really try and gain even more ground on their arch rivals. Ole Miss head coach Lane Kiffin is another possibility here for the Alabama Crimson Tide. South Carolina, they haven't played Ole Miss a ton in the past few years, but they're getting ready to play them every other year with this new SEC football scheduling format that's starting up in 2024. And Lane Kiffin, the Ole Miss Rebels, they've been viewed as a program that is quite similar to South Carolina. They've had their good spurts throughout their football history, but they've also had a lot of down years. And right now, honestly, Ole Miss is probably going through their glory years as a football program. If Lane Kiffin were to get poached by Alabama, and I certainly could see him being interested in that job, then Ole Miss, they would have to work hard to try to find someone that could somehow match what Lane Kiffin has done over the past few years, which is elevate the perception and stature of that football program, at least for the time being. And I don't think that Ole Miss could strike gold twice in terms of that aspect. I think you'd probably see them fall down a peg or two, and it would give South Carolina, therefore, a chance to possibly try and surpass them over the next couple years if they were to get things back on track. And then the last coach, Texas head coach Steve Sarkisian. Now, South Carolina, they don't have really any history with Texas. The reason why I mention this is because, again, just like Ole Miss, South Carolina's about to play Texas a lot more often, as weird as it is to say, in the very near future because of the new scheduling model here in the Southeastern Conference. And with Texas, they just got back onto the national map, being in the college football playoff. They were officially back, finally, in 2023. If Sarkisian leaves, then it could end up hurting the Longhorns and potentially, again, bumping them back down to where they were at before, which was an 8 to potentially 10-win program over the past 10, 15 years. Also, depending on who Alabama hires as their next head coach, they could end up looking at assistants that Shane Beamer used to work alongside, maybe at Georgia. And I say that because of how expansive Nick Saban's coaching tree is. And you have to imagine with the philosophy that Alabama is looking for in their new head coach, that they're probably going to try to stick with some of the same kind of guys in that aspect. And so, if that winds up being the case, the candidate pool for Shane Beamer, if he was looking for a certain assistant coach at a certain spot on his staff, it would be narrowed to a certain degree. It would see certain names scratched off the list if they were to go to Alabama. So that's also something to bear in mind with this entire process. Now, Alabama also has some players on their roster that South Carolina has been interested in the past. And right now, the Bama players, they have 30 days to enter the transfer portal because of the fact that their head coach has officially moved on, per the NCAA transfer portal rules. So South Carolina, hey, there's guys like LT Overton on this team, Daniel Hill, Justin Okoronkwo, Amari Jefferson, Dylan Lonergan, Ty Lockwood, Antonio Kite. All these guys are familiar with South Carolina because they visited South Carolina at a time in their recruiting process, or the Gamecocks, they were very close to landing them for a couple of these guys. Now, admittedly, I think that's very unlikely that the majority of these guys go to South Carolina because, obviously, for one, South Carolina won't be the only team that's interested in some of these players, but also it's kind of depending on the situation, but they don't have a whole lot of room at this point with all the guys that they've already landed out of the transfer portal. The only guy that I think they could potentially go after is maybe an Amari Jefferson and Antonio Kite, because Jefferson, he played for former Gamecock Eric Kimry at the Baylor School in Tennessee, so they've got that connection there. Antonio Kite, he's the one guy that took an official visit to South Carolina, besides Dylan Lonergan, who I also mentioned earlier. So those two, potentially three guys, I could see a path where maybe they wind up in Columbia, but I don't think it's likely. So we'll just have to see which guys enter the portal and if South Carolina decides to pursue them once they enter the portal. And the last thing I will say real quickly, and this is kind of a given with Nick Saban retiring, but the path up the SEC ladder is a little bit easier now because Nick Saban is no longer here. Now, obviously, it's not like South Carolina's got a cakewalk at this point. Again, they're coming off a 5-7 season where they've got to show tremendous improvement in 2024. Shane Beamer's got to be able to adapt to a certain degree. And also, Kirby Smart, last time we all checked, is still the head coach at Georgia. And Georgia, essentially, right now is kind of the new Alabama in terms of their dominance and how much they've won over the past few seasons. So, again, it's easier, but it's not that much easier. And then you throw in the fact Texas and Oklahoma are joining the SEC, and it's not maybe quite as big of a deal in that regard as it would have been, say, 5, 6, 7 years ago if Nick Saban had retired then. But point being, you might not think that it's really the case, but depending on how all these dominoes fall, Nick Saban retiring from Alabama, it could have an effect on South Carolina when it comes to potential coaches in the future, maybe their own rivalry with Clemson if Dabo winds up being their guy. We're just going to have to see how everything plays out over there in Tuscaloosa.